Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, we're here for Staking Out the Enemy, Understanding ID Verification in a Digital World. My name is Ryan. I'll be your host for today's webinar. I've got Matt Kuo here from Urjanet and Kevin King from ID Analytics. We'll give it a few minutes and let people get started here shortly. We'll give it a few more minutes. It looks like there's still some people trickling in here. I've got Matt Kuo from Urjanet and Kevin King from ID Analytics here talking about ID verification. We'll get started in probably 1 or 2 more minutes. All right, folks, let's get started with Staking Out the Enemy, Understanding ID Verification in a Digital World. I'll hand it off to Matt, and he'll tell you about the battle for your identity.
Thanks, Ryan. Just to set the stage a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of ID verification over the years. Previously, verifying a person's identity was a relatively simple process and mainly done face-to-face or in person. Consumers could go and open an account by presenting a form of government-issued ID or proof of residence or proof of residence like a utility bill. And often this experience also had the element of a long-standing relationship. Either your parents were part of that bank or that institution, or you had a referral from a friend. And all of this was relatively good until we started to see a major shift into online-only channels. And that really started to create a new era of fraudulent activity where these face-to-face interactions were no longer a valid verification method. To put this in perspective, in 2017, PwC conducted their digital banking consumer survey and found that 46% of consumers used digital-only channels today. Only 4 years ago, that was 27%, so there's been a big increase there. In addition, Urjanet recently conducted a survey that found that nearly 40% of respondents said that they wanted to open an account using either a desktop or mobile device, with 50% responding that they wanted ongoing support, either through a desktop or mobile device as well. So the shift is happening and it continues to accelerate with many consumers often going mobile only or mobile first.
Right. There's a lot of liability there though, right?
Yeah. I really see a lot, Ryan. This is Kevin from ID Analytics, and I think Matt hit the trend dead on what really changing up into the fraud landscape over the last 15 or 20 years. Increasingly, consumers are making that choice and really pushing companies into opening up online channels, not just for account maintenance, but for origination as well. And so you've seen consumers drive this shift to the point where, at ID Analytics, we see very, very few organizations that are still unwilling, at least through kind of an online channel, maybe not a digital app, but at least an online channel, allow for account opening activity there. And while it's something that consumers have really pushed companies into, it's an extremely popular development for fraudsters. Right? When we look at the online channel from a fraud perspective, the odds of getting caught go dramatically down, right? You don't have that face-to-face interaction, right? There isn't, especially if you're requesting documents or anything like that, it's a lot tougher to, in a face-to-face environment, create that fictitious impression. And then beyond that, if for whatever reason you were to get caught, and the application were to get shut down, actually getting in true legal trouble, right? Any kind of prosecution is really difficult when a fraudster is operating through an online channel. They haven't given you their real name, and will a company really dedicate the resources to finding out who submitted that application and prosecuting them? Much less likely than a in-store scenario where you're caught red-handed and absolutely you risk prosecution there. So for all of those reasons, the online channel has become this haven for fraud attempts. But at the same time as you've seen this rise in popularity with that online and digital channel for fraud, you're also seeing the raw materials needed to perpetrate the crime grow as well. And that's where you start to talk about data breaches. We've got a figure up here of 4.2 billion records that were stolen globally in 2016. The Identity Theft Resource Center put out their 2016 fraud and data breach report about 6 or 7 months ago. I think they cited, I want to say, 40% rise in U.S. data breaches in 2016 over 2015. I think nobody on this call needs to be briefed on what 2017 may look like, right? The trend continues. And so the raw materials that a fraudster needs to impersonate someone's identity has really went through the roof, right? Really, really easy to get these days. The financial impact of the collision here of online channel and ease of availability for that raw material of personal information is really big, both on the consumer side of the fence and on the fraudster side of the fence. To give you an idea in fraud attempt differences, in an in-store channel versus a online channel, I see anywhere from 2 to 10, even 15x the number of fraud attempts that lenders and service providers are seeing through digital channels than through in-store channels. And when they're successful, it's really painful. Javelin and ID Analytics recently did a study that tried to put a dollar figure to the pain that people are feeling. Consumers are facing an average of $400 in terms of both the direct financial loss and the effort to repair a single fraudulent attempt that's been perpetrated at a lender. And financial institutions average roughly $3,200 per fraudulent transaction or application. And all of this has really created a surge in the demand for identity verification solutions, right? If it's easier than ever for fraudsters to commit this crime, and the financial stakes are this high, all of a sudden you need strong strategies at each one of your customer touch points. We're seeing a market right now for those identity verification solutions that is likely to get close to 10 billion by the year 2021.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks for providing those stats. I mean, I think it's really, really clear how big of a problem this is becoming. And again, with the growing demand from consumers to move to the online space, as well as this increased risk, we're seeing that a lot of organizations are really at a crossroads right now of security, but then also user experience. At one end of the spectrum, we're seeing really heavy-handed approaches where multiple steps and multiple tactics are being implemented to deter fraudulent activity, but it comes at the sacrifice of a really great user experience. And so there's also valid customers that are being deterred because they've given up. I think we've all had experiences where we wanted to do something, there's too many steps, and then we said, forget about it, I'll come back later. And then you have all the way on the other end of the spectrum where a streamlined user experience can be great for valid customers, but then it's also great for fraudsters as well. Minimal pieces of data being collected to verify the identity, really causes issues there, but it is a great user experience. So there really is that fine balance that needs to be struck in order to effectively engage your valid customers while blocking the fraudulent ones. And so there are many digital ID verification methods today, and we're continuing to see more and more evolve and emerge over time to combat evolving fraud tactics. Today, Kevin's going to talk about two commonly used methods: two-step verification, often seen in the online lending space, as well as multi-factor authentication used by many digital applications like Venmo or Facebook or Airbnb, for example.
Thanks, Matt. So as you kind of teed us up there, we'll start with the idea of two-step verification, which we should draw kind of a clean line between two-step verification and two-factor authentication, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. So two-step verification, you also hear this called two-step authentication. It is broken into a passive assessment of identity verification, where the consumer doesn't realize they're being evaluated. You're not putting them through any friction. It's kind of transparent from that perspective. And then a second step, which involves some kind of assessment of knowledge. So in that first step, that you're doing that passive identity verification evaluation, the kind of evaluation you're doing is really going to vary based on what the goals of your identity verification strategy is. And we're talking a lot about fraud in this webinar, and if you're doing a fraud-focused verification, that's a higher standard than kind of a compliance-based strategy. You're likely going to use some kind of assessment that's looking at the fraud risk associated with the event. So ID Analytics has a tool called ID Score that the majority of the online lenders and large credit card issuers that Matt referenced deploy for this today, that allows you to assess everybody and figure out which individuals may present a high risk. You also see those kind of tools put out by the big three bureaus. But the goal in that evaluation is to say, is this consumer potentially lying about their identity, right? Maybe they're lying to me at account opening. Maybe they're lying trying to get access to a pre-existing account and they're impersonating an account holder. Are they lying to me about their identity? Now, you also see a lot of identity verification processes that are more kind of know your customer or KYC compliance focused. And those tools are doing a much more basic evaluation that is saying, does this name, does this address, does this social security number, does it go together? Is the identity that's been presented to me real? And you see that being something that's offered by, again, the big three bureaus, public records companies. ID Analytics has a solution called Comply 360. All of these attempts to give a high-level kind of compliance-ready evaluation of whether the identity seems to be real. Now, regardless of what your goals were and the kind of evaluation and that passive assessment you did in step one, the second step in this two-step verification process is really focusing on what the consumer knows, right? It's going to be, in other words, a challenge question scenario where the lender, the enterprise, the service provider is going to present some kind of question or series of questions to the individual to not only kind of confirm that the identity is real, but authenticate them as the true consumer. So you can kind of think of your options here as varying based on the use case. We'll separate for ease of conversation. Account opening and account access to a pre-existing account, right? At account opening, the most common tool is knowledge-based authentication, also known as KBA quizzes. We've all went through them, right? You get presented a multiple choice series of answers to questions like, what address did you live at 5 years ago? These are, frankly, not great options, right? There aren't a lot of alternatives that are really appealing at account opening for two-step verification, but a recent study, I think from Gartner back in the spring of this year, showed that true consumers only pass these quizzes about 70% of the time. Fraudsters tend to get through them about 60% of the time. So not only are close to a third of the real consumers struggling and maybe abandoning your account opening process because they can't get through this quiz, most fraudsters are beating this system as well, right? So not a great option, but still allows you that second layer of protection beyond that passive evaluation to say, do I have the right individual? Should I let them in? Now, on a, you've got a few more advantages. You have a pre-existing relationship with a consumer, so you know things about them. Very often, you don't see that KBA quiz method being used here. Instead, we'll present challenge questions. We'll test your knowledge of the identity you claim to own by what's often known as shared secret questions. And I think most of us have been through those as well. When you've opened an account somewhere and they've said, hey, tell me your high school mascot. Tell me your favorite singer, things like that. But yet you run into a similar set of problems there that you had in KBA. The more creative you get to try and fool fraudsters, the more true consumers struggle to pass these tests, right? So you could make the quiz something like the high school mascot example. But that's something that fraudsters can research pretty easily. So the consumer will remember that, and it'll be pretty low friction, but a fraudster might get there. Then you may create creative questions like, what's your favorite singer? Or what's your favorite movie? And that's, of course, fairly difficult for a fraudster to research, but consumers are pretty inconsistent in those opinions. They change. So there's no guarantee that what somebody put down when you threw this question at them at account opening and kind of put them on the spot will be the same way they answer that question a week later, a month later, or a year later. So two-step verification can work in some scenarios, but that challenge question concept is often really difficult for enterprises to strike the right balance on. So that's two-step verification. I think the next process we want to go to, and I think where you see a lot of more technology and risk-centric companies moving to, is multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, which is just one of many forms of multi-factor. So the idea here is this is actually kind of an evolution of that second phase of two-step verification. Right? I still see a lot of online lenders, a lot of the kind of payment companies that Matt mentioned earlier, they still do that passive assessment of risk before they move into authentication, the same way we saw in that two-step process. So everybody goes through that process. And then what they may say is, based on that evaluation, I'm going to use what's called a risk-based strategy. I feel pretty good about 90%, maybe it's 95% of the people who are trying to open an account with me from a fraud perspective or trying to access an account. And I've got 5% of people maybe who that passive evaluation that the consumer didn't even know was happening, it caused me to have some concerns. And so now I'm going to put them through multi-factor or two-factor authentication. And if we remember that two-step process that we just spoke about was focused on something a consumer knows, that would be considered a single factor. So to get to two-factor or even three-factor, we're going to also look into something a consumer possesses, and that could be a phone or a key phone, and or something the consumer is, right? So you can think of biometrics being a really good example of something that a consumer is physically. And as you pair those factors together, you start to come together with this two-factor, or again, if you have all three of those, a multi-factor strategy. And that may sound complicated, but we've all went through a lot of these things on I'm guessing maybe not a daily basis, but at least a monthly basis. Think about accessing maybe a Gmail account or accessing a Venmo payment, right? So at Gmail, they run an SMS one-time password version of two-factor authentication. And what that means is that you're putting in your password to access the account. And that's something that you know, right? So I have my one factor there. And then Gmail often says, if you've enabled this feature, hey, I'm going to send a special code to your phone and have you enter that. And because the phone is something that you possess in theory, that's giving you a second factor. Right? For Venmo, they often use something that's considered, I think, a little more secure, which are in-app push notifications. Right? It's not going to go through some of the wireless towers that we'll talk about in a moment, which can potentially be compromised. But anytime you're stacking these processes together, hey, I asked for a password, I asked for a PIN, and then maybe took a thumbprint on your phone. Maybe I took a photo of your palm on your phone, or did ask for a selfie to do selfie authentication. All of those combinations start to create a multi-factor strategy. And generally speaking, it's considered more secure, though sometimes more friction heavy, as you're thinking about that balance between security and convenience that Matt articulated in developing a strong identity verification process. So on this slide, we're going to kind of give a sobering reminder, and I tipped our hand a little bit to the fact that, in particular, a two-factor strategy that might leverage SMS one-time password isn't foolproof. And in fact, I would argue that no two-factor or multi-factor process is foolproof today. There's nothing on the market that we could put at your enterprise and say this guarantees that 100% of fraudulent attempts will not have success. Right? Very often you're trying to build a process that's again hitting that balance between how much security do I need and how much do I need to be worried about protecting the customer experience. The SMS one-time password, I'm going to send a unique passcode to your phone that only works for the next 10 minutes, is a really popular form of two-factor authentication. Give me a password, then I send the code and enter the code. And it's popular in part because most consumers feel that this is pretty easy to do. They have their phone on them at all times. It's not a pain to carry that around in the way that some people dislike having what's often called a key fob that kind of sits on a keychain. So this is a really popular thing to do. But it has its challenges. And we're showing here how fraudsters can manipulate this process. Right? A consumer tries to, let's say, access their bank account at a top 10 US bank. And they enter their password, and the bank then sends authentication codes to confirm your identity, right? They've established that you've met factor one, something you know. Now they want to see if you possess a item that's going to help authenticate you with the phone, right? So they send those codes. Those codes go through multiple cell service towers, and those towers see duplicate SIM cards because that fraudster in advance has been able to request a new SIM card from the wireless provider and has a method of ensuring that the consumer doesn't get that alert. Only the fraudster receives that alert. And that's really important here. It's not enough for the fraudster to receive the code. They need to make sure that the true consumer doesn't get the code and becomes aware that maybe someone is trying to get into their account that they don't want to give access to. So the true consumer never gets that one-time password. The fraudster is able to snatch it, and all of a sudden, they have their second factor. They have something that the true consumer knew because they somehow had the password, and now they've been able to get the one-time password to the SMS process and now have carte blanche to the account, right? Maybe that means opening an account, but very often this is about account access. And all of a sudden I'm doing balance transfers, I'm requesting new merchandise, things like that. So, nothing is foolproof, right? And I think we also need to remember some of those success rates we talked about earlier with knowledge-based authentication in that two-step process where, only 70% of consumers were getting through and 60% of fraudsters were getting through. You compare something like this process to that, you're dramatically improving the situation, right? So everything isn't necessarily perfect here, but it may not need to be, particularly if the customer experience is a really critical item for your organization.
Thanks, Kevin. I think it's really clear that there's no real foolproof method to completely block fraud. But as you were mentioning, with two-step and multi-factor authentication, they're common right now. A lot of us are familiar with them, and they each have their own pros and cons. Really, the future of ID verification lies in creating a strategic combination of multiple different types of verification, and that can be anywhere from the two-factor authentication that you were mentioning. You also talked about biometric data as well, like fingerprints, even all the way through to utility data or direct from the source data, and combining those together with real-time verification of these sources in the context for the consumer that provides that user experience is really critical to building that arsenal of ID verification tactics. From the biometric perspective, you touched on this earlier. A lot of innovative technology companies are using methods like fingerprint authentication or facial recognition. You also mentioned the selfies or taking a picture of your palm. And so there's a lot of companies pushing the envelope there from a biometric perspective. And they're integrating those in really slick user experiences during the time of application, at the time of login, or even during purchasing flows. And these are really effective because they're using the actual hardware and features that are available on device, which are a little harder to fake, but again, not necessarily foolproof. So in addition to some of these biometric data sources, utility data is emerging as something that is a really great way to verify identities. And the Urjanet utility data platform is able to provide near real-time access to that utility data and using things like the address on the bill to verify an applicant's information. Because this data comes directly from the utility provider and requires only that the consumer opts into the service to provide access to data, it's a really trusted source for data because there's little to no chance that it can actually be tampered with since it comes directly from the utility provider. And then in addition, you mentioned some of the products that ID Analytics provides where real-time access to additional data sources can also be used in context during those user experience flows to really allow transactions to continue and allow the user to continue to do what they're looking for. So really overall, not having one or implementing one of these methods is really the right answer. It's really having a combination of multiple different methods and direct from source data along with real-time verification is really what the key is here, and finding that fine line and balance between a heavy-handed approach and then something that might be a little too easy for fraudsters to go around. That's really what many of our organizations that we work with are looking to do and are really making some great headway in.
And to underscore that point before we leave this slide, I couldn't really overemphasize how important it is to combine these things. At ID Analytics, we've done a lot of research into fraud methodologies and how different fraudsters specialize. And what you often find is they're really good at one type of crime. They're really good at faking biometrics, right? They may have a good way to beat one type of process. But as you stack up all these defenses, you're asking the fraudster, frankly, to get a broader range of skills, to spend more money and time to commit a certain fraud. And ultimately, that becomes a fantastic deterrent. It's not just that you're building more and more walls, but you're making it more expensive and less convenient to commit a crime at your organization. So again, maybe you're great at faking a thumbprint, that you've got the technology down to do that, or you really know how to intercept an SMS password. You've got some line into some portion of direct from source data, but you likely don't have all of these things. So I think that's a fantastic point, Matt, when we think about best practices on this strategy. So building your arsenal here, how do we implement direct from source data into your business, right? What does this challenge look like? I really divide up the challenge of implementing an identity verification strategy into two parts. The first is building the strategy, figuring out what you want to do, and then there's the technical implementation aspect. And I think in both cases, the how hard is it, how difficult is it question comes down to this can be very straightforward so long as you have the right partners, the right vendors that you're working with who are going to take a really consultative approach to supporting your objectives. So from a strategy standpoint, another key theme, and I know I've reiterated Matt's initial points here a couple of times on this, understanding that know your use case. Each use case presents a different set of risks and has different stakes on the customer experience. Right? You may, for example, feel that at account opening, you stand to lose a lot of money, and most of your consumers are going to be willing to go through some amount of friction. And because of that, you're going to build a process that is very fraud focused, that asks the consumer to jump through a few hoops because you feel like that's the right balance of fraud and security for that specific use case. And then you may look at something like account access, so logging into your account, or the process of updating an address or a phone or an email on an existing account, and say, look, the balance between the potential loss I face and the potential damage I do if I deliver a really poor customer experience, that calculus is really different from what I did at account opening. And so I need to adjust my strategies and my tools to fit that specific moment. I think most vendor partners should also work with you to understand that what's right for company A isn't right for company B. Right? Especially when you go across industries, you can think of a large online lender who's offering unsecured personal loans. Right? Every fraud loss to them may be $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 a piece. And their philosophy may be that once a consumer has engaged in the underwriting process, that consumer should be willing to jump through a lot of hoops for that amount of money. Right? So you set your dial to being pretty aggressive, pretty friction heavy to keep out the vast majority of fraud. And then you think of, let's say, a national retailer that offers a kind of retail credit card at the point of checkout. That's a situation where they say, look, the fraud loss may not be that great on an individual fraud basis. But if I start to create a friction heavy experience and consumers walk out of the store, when I'd already spent all that money marketing wise to get them into the store, they had a basket of goods they were ready to buy, I lose all of that. I'm going to say that I'm willing to let a little bit more fraud in to really protect the customer experience. So you should be working with partners that understand that balance. It's not strictly on you guys to design those strategies and recognize those nuances. Hopefully you have a good partner with you that can help guide you along the kind of the strategy formulation process. And then on the technical side, again, the right partner makes this pretty easy, right? Both Urjanet and ID Analytics work with a lot of platform providers, have experience serving very large companies, very small companies, and you want somebody that has that diversity of experience because they should be able to run at your pace from a technical implementation standpoint. That means and it potentially move very fast, right? When we work with tech startups, they move really fast. Your company may also have a lot of hurdles, and you need someone who's going to be patient as you step through that process and know what that's like. So a company that has the right relationships and set of experiences so that they can collaborate with you and move at your pace ultimately makes the technical implementation process pretty easy. One other point that I think comes up a lot in developing direct from source data is what kind of data do you need? And I'd certainly be remiss in not bringing up utility data, telecommunications data as insights that are critically important to both of our organizations' ability to help you with identity verification. When you think about what's important in these processes, whether your goal is fraud defense through identity verification, or you're more compliance focused, the more you know, the better you do. Right? The more you know, the more good consumers get through with little friction, and the more your high-risk individuals get put through the appropriate processes. And that comes down to coverage, right? The more you know is about how many U.S. consumers you've seen before and have an opinion on. And compared to, we'll use the 3 national credit bureaus that are really dialed in on a few specific lending markets, tapping into utility data, which doesn't miss 45 million consumers who are underbanked, but sees the kind of the full spectrum, the full population of U.S. consumers, allows you to get ultimately a more efficient and effective process. So when I think about direct from source data and what's key to this process, utility data, telecommunications data is certainly at the top of our list.
Yeah, Kevin, I think you really hit a lot of that right on the head there. We also see that when you start to look internationally as well, utility data becomes one of those data sources that is consistent. Not only utility data, but also telecommunications data, like you were mentioning before. And in terms of being able to address issues before they arise, I think you really covered a lot of the main points there around really understanding the customer journey, really understanding the customer touch points, and how the customer interacts with the application or the service, and thinking about those things up front, and then having a strategy and being able to make data-driven decisions around the trade-offs between fraudulent activity and that customer experience. I'd layer one additional item on there as well, is just thinking about consumer privacy upfront, especially with the increasing industry emphasis on consumer privacy right now. Having an opt-in method and an on-demand method to accessing data to verify identities is something that's becoming more and more important to stay ahead of regulatory and compliance issues. And really the on-demand model minimizes that risk of breaches as data is requested when it's needed, at the time it's needed, via something like an API, and really starts to minimize the risk there from a data breach perspective.
All right, well, thanks for the insights, guys. At this point, we'll turn it over to QA and give people a few minutes to enter some of their questions. It looks like we already have one in here. What sort of pitfalls should I be aware of in this implementation process?
I can take that one. So some of the pitfalls, I think we kind of, both Kevin and I touched on it throughout this presentation, and it's really about striking that balance between user experience and the deterrent of fraudulent activity. So don't be too heavy-handed in terms of implementing some of these technologies. Be very, very cognizant of that user experience and ensuring that you understand your different types of customers and where are the touch points where fraudulent activity is more prevalent, and how can you implement the right tactics at the right places. And I think another pitfall is thinking that one thing is going to, or one method is going to fix the problem overall, and you kind of implement one thing and then kind of walk away from it and never have to worry about it again. This is an ongoing initiative, I think, for most organizations, and it's something that you are always watching. And because fraud tactics continue to evolve and fraudsters get smarter, you also have to continue to build your arsenal and continue to evolve your tactics and your experience to really ensure success from a long-term perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It looks like there's a follow-up to that one. Do you guys have, in your experience, an example of a good implementation or a bad implementation?
How about I give a good, and then Matt, maybe you can give a bad.
That sounds good.
With a good implementation, yeah, I'm thinking back maybe about 18 months ago to a large online lender who was revamping their process for identity verification. This is kind of more fintech-oriented company. And they were moving away from some of these super heavy-handed approaches that Matt kind of warned about with his pitfalls there. And very often, good implementations are inspired and informed by some not so good ones, right? So they had realized what was working and what wasn't working. And so when it came down to do this implementation, they were really thoughtful on a lot of the best practices that we've hit on in this webinar. They looked through their various customer touch points where they needed verification, they needed some kind of authentication, and looked at the importance of security versus convenience at each one of those. And for example, this lender had a need to authenticate new investors to the site as well as new loan seekers. Right? So not only were people coming to this website to potentially get a new loan, people were coming to this website to invest money that could be loaned out to people. So kind of a peer-to-peer process. And they saw the risk versus convenience calculus being really different there, where the investor, they were a little bit less worried about fraud threats. They were more worried about getting interested people into the door and investing. So their strategy lever kind of moved a lot more towards a frictionless experience and was a little more lenient when it came to security. Flip side of that was at account opening, for credit seekers, people who were looking for new loans, they were really worried about fraud, right? So they were willing, as we kind of talked about earlier, because the losses were potentially so high, to be really friction intense, kind of a little heavy-handed, like Matt said. And in that particular moment, they felt it was appropriate. Then they looked at account login and said, look, these are all situations where, based on the information and the experience I've had with individuals in the past, I'm comfortable taking a risk-based approach, only scrutinizing the highest risk 2 or 3% of people at login according to my assessments. And even went so far as to say, look, if you change your password, I'm going to treat that differently than if you try and transfer money in and out of that lender's service. So each one of those situations, being really thoughtful about what are the risks of friction, what are the risks of being too lenient, and once they had their priorities straight, it became really easy to get the right tools in there and to really improve the way they were running identity verification.
Yeah, Kevin, that's a really good example of an organization that's really thinking about that customer experience, like we've mentioned before, really knowing the different places that a customer might go in their service and understanding the risk at each one of those levels. My bad example, I won't name any names, but because of our work with multiple utility companies around the world, I've seen some implementations that are very, very heavy-handed where for example, two-factor authentication is implemented on the login page, and it's implemented across the board, and really every single customer has to go through this process. And so if you think about that, even the good customers are being impacted by having to take out their mobile phone to enter in the passcode that's sent via SMS or do some other form of verification when they're really not a risk at all to the experience. And so something as heavy-handed as that is one of the bad examples that we often see, where the understanding of the customer journey isn't optimal. But looking at things like where would be a better place to implement something like that, and I think you just mentioned in your good example where the reset password page is probably a place where, if a fraudster was coming to the site, the first thing they would do to try to take over that account would be to reset the password and set it to something that they would know so that they could access that account. And so again, kind of harping on what we've mentioned before, but that heavy-handed approach and not really thinking about that customer journey is one of the bad examples that I see live in more places than we realize.
Yeah, it seems like security design here can really be a strength or a weakness for some of these folks. So here's another question. What sort of scope or timeline do these implementations typically have? What does the typical process look like?
So I'll weigh in here. In terms of timelines, it really varies. First, on the scope of the project, right? Are you trying to just tweak one thing, like, hey, I want to get better identity verification at login, or are you doing a wholesale restructuring of each customer touch point? So a company is going to really dictate, I would say, two things: the scope of the project and, to some degree, the timelines, right? That certainly no vendor is going to move faster than you're going to. But beyond that, it's then I think the burden shifts to the vendor partner, rather, on how quickly they can execute that scope and vision, right? So the mantra that we have at ID Analytics is we will run as fast as you want us to when it comes to the technical piece here. I'd say that we've seen implementations go as fast as 2 to 3 weeks. For a startup that had a really tight date to make. We've also had companies, quite frankly, where this stretched out due to their own timelines and preferences, 7, 8 months. So it all depends on what your goals are. But again, once you have those defined, if you have the right partners, you're going to stick to that timeline and scope.
Thanks, Kevin. It looks like that's about all the time we have for today. There's a couple questions we weren't able to answer, but what we'll do is have Kevin and Matt weigh in on those, and we'll actually publish a blog post that also recaps some of the other questions we covered in the QA. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.